and welcome to another educational video by Catspit Productions about screen printing. Today I wanted to give some points and talk about ink coverage. What factors affect the coverage of ink that you get on your t-shirt when you print it. Okay, and now let me start and preface by saying there are many variables in screen printing. So what I find the best thing to do is to eliminate all the variables that you possibly can. That way you're starting at a 0 point, so to speak, because in screen printing, inevitably when you print a run, especially a long run, a large run of high quantity, you can find things happening during the print run, okay? Things that will affect how you're going to have to print throughout the print run, or perhaps things that you never even would have thought would happen will start to surface in, say, printing maybe, well, sometimes even just 100 pieces. It all depends on the artwork and the inks that you're using sometimes. So let's just start by talking about your mesh. You know, the mesh and the frame, okay? First of all, it's really important for good, consistent, even coverage that you have a nice tight frame. I was struggling for the word there for a minute. You want it to be very tight as much as you can. Now I think, if I recall correctly, this is measured in newtons. There are actually devices, there's a little Newton meter, which I actually have one here somewhere, but there's a meter that you put on here that measures the tension of the fabric on the screen in newtons. Okay, and I can't remember, I think for a frame like this, I think it's like maybe 24 to 30 newtons, something around there. But basically, you want it pretty tight. A lot of guys in the old days used to bounce a quarter on it, and if the quarter bounces nice in all areas, they would be happy with it. So you want to make sure your mesh is tight, and also that your frame is sure and square. You don't want to, you have to be careful with wood frames. They can get old and weak and move around and cause the mesh to become loose. You want to be careful with wood frames. Make sure your wood frames are in good condition and they're tight, nice and sure, so that when you're even working it in the press, the frame shouldn't move within the bracket. So you have the frame in the bracket, and a wood frame, as it gets old, will tend to move at the joints. And as you move up and down and move around in the press, that can be a problem. So, tight mesh, excellent frame is going to help you with ink coverage. Secondly, about the mesh is your mesh count. Okay, once you have your stencil on here, you really actually, when you're going to print different inks, say you want to print white ink on a black shirt, when you make that screen, you're going to want to use the appropriate mesh, okay? In my particular preferences and experience, I like to use 110 mesh, pretty much straight across for my t-shirt printing. I get good detail with that, and I have no problem holding fine lines and stuff. It works pretty well, and it's easy to work with. But if you're working with higher mesh counts because of maybe you're doing halftones, or maybe you're doing fine lines or fine detail, and then you want to go ahead and print white, you're going to have a harder time printing white with a higher mesh count. So, in order to increase the ease of which to print, and also the more opacity, the more coverage on the shirt, you're going to use a more open mesh, a 110, say. Okay? The more open the mesh is, the more ink that will be deposited onto the screen. So with a higher mesh count, it's going to be harder to get that good coverage of white ink on a black shirt that you want. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind, is your mesh count. Make sure your mesh count is appropriate for what you're trying to print. Okay? Now that doesn't mean that you couldn't print white ink with a 205 mesh. There are ways to do it, but it entails maybe a little bit more work. If you use a 110 mesh with white ink on a black shirt, you can actually, if you're very good at flooding and stroking, you can get excellent coverage with one hit without flashing it and hitting it again. And we'll look at that in the future. We'll do a demo video of that in the future. Okay, so also with the screen is your stencil thickness, the emulsion. How thick is your emulsion on the screen? The thicker the emulsion is on the screen, the more space it allows for the ink to be deposited on the shirt. Okay, so the thicker your stencil is, the more three-dimensional it is, the more you can feel it as you rub across the back here. You can actually feel the depth of the stencil. The bigger the depth of that stencil is, the better coverage you're going to get. Okay, another thing you want to consider when you're trying to get excellent coverage is your off contact on the press. And if you've watched my previous videos, you can recall that your off contact refers to the distance between the screen and the shirt on the palette, okay? You always want a little bit of off contact, and there are many different reasons for that. But let's just say that make sure your off contact is consistent, level, and at least you know, something that you're comfortable with working with, not too high and not too low. And again, there are standards for that, but I think it really depends on the individual. Screen printing is a lot about the individual, especially manual. Manual screen printing can take a lot of finesse, and what works for one guy might not work for the next guy so much. So like I said, you start by eliminating all the variables that you can at a 0 point, and you work from there and you adapt and change accordingly. Okay, so you're off contact. Another thing you want to consider is your squeegee. The squeegee can have a lot to do with how much ink is deposited on the t-shirt. Okay, softer squeegees, more flexible, softer squeegees will scrape off less ink as you go across the screen. Harder squeegees will scrape off more ink. Okay, so obviously if you scrape off less ink, you're depositing more ink. If you scrape off more ink, you're depositing less ink. So you'll want to experiment, and again, this could be a personal preference. It all depends on how you feel, how you like to flood and stroke. What is your particular preference? Some people actually may prefer a slightly harder squeegee, but still obtain the same result. Okay, but in general, it's a good idea to use a softer squeegee when you want to leave more ink on the t-shirt, and a harder squeegee when you want to use less ink on the t-shirt, when you want to leave less ink on the t-shirt. Pardon me. Okay, so that's something you have to consider as well. Okay, you want to choose a good ink. First of all, you want to make sure for t-shirt inks, you know, the only ink that I have experience with, because I've been mostly involved in professional screen printing, is textile Plastisol inks, and they have a very good opacity for t-shirts most of the time. So when you're printing white ink on a black shirt, you want to choose an ink that you're comfortable with. Its performance. You want an ink that you know is going to perform well for you. Okay. I have tended to like in the past Triangle Inks Phoenix White. That has been a favorite for me over years. However, I have used many different white inks, and honestly, a lot of them perform very well. Again, I think, I guess I could say that the ink is probably less important. It isn't the most important. The most important is your technique and your tension, your mesh count, your frame, your off contact, your squeegee, and then last would be the ink. I guess that's why we did it in that order, because you can work with different inks and obtain good results, even though the ink, one ink might perform better on one pass than the other, but that doesn't mean that you can't get both inks to give you good coverage. Okay, and I think that's about it. This video, I hope wasn't too confusing. I know I talked about a lot of different things, and please feel free to ask questions. Just message me, ask questions. I have no problem responding. Just give me some time and I respond to all the questions. Thanks for watching Cat's Pit Productions educational videos. Don't forget to visit eBay and check out all the different t-shirts that I have on there for sale.